So what I'll present today is slightly different from the paper you received because it's a new version that we still have to write up, but you'll see it's basically more results on top of what the paper already has. Hopefully. Well, comments are very welcome. I'm excited to present this for the first time. All right, so the motivation for what we do is that there's lots of evidence that poor parents often underinvest in their children's education. So just as an example, this famous paper by Robert Jensen from Costa Rica, or sorry, Dominican Republic, shows that while secondary school completion rates were well below 30% back in 2010, there was this huge premium from actually finishing secondary school. So you could earn 40% more just by having your secondary school, your high school degree. And you just fell short of finishing it. But still, how could it be that only 30% of students were finishing high school then? And then he goes on to show in the paper that very simple interventions can boost those rates up. So there is probably a market failure there. There is a compelling reason to say that these parents should be keeping their schools longer in school to make sense of those high premiums of actually getting the high school degree. But that's not by any means exclusive to education. So more broadly, there's lots of evidence that in poor countries, parents underinvest in children's health and education. And it's not just that they invest less despite the high returns. There's often lots of investment misallocation, meaning parents of children that would have high returns from those investments don't invest, and parents of children that would have kind of low returns and undertake those investments. So it's quite shocking that it's not just low investment, it's also kind of the wrong parents who are investing in their children. Why would that be the case? So there's some explanations. They're the most common ones that we kind of know a lot about. So first reason would be liquidity constraints. So poor parents, they often have more benefits from children actually dropping out of school, for instance. So they might have more child labor to make a living. Also, they tend to have less cash on hand to just finance those investments when they're costly. So there's both an opportunity cost and an actual cost of undertaking those investments, and the poor would suffer more from undertaking those costs. There's also lots of evidence on poor parents having wrong beliefs about returns, even from this paper in the Dominican Republic. Parents and children hugely underestimate the returns in terms of future earnings and probability of actually pursuing those investments. But by no means those are the only reasons why parents might underinvest. And in particular, in this paper, we're interested in whether attention misallocation, which I'll explain more, driven by poverty, could also be an important driver of underinvestment. I'll show you now quickly some evidence that poverty tends to shape how our executive functions of the brain tend to operate, refocusing mental bandwidth on immediate needs, and that comes at the expense of having mental bandwidth for everything else. So in other words, being constantly worried about making ends meet is like a tax on the poor's cognitive resources. And again, there's lots of evidence on that. In this paper, we want to look at whether this also affects the ability of those parents to evaluate returns on investments on children, and then ultimately lead to underinvestment as well. That's just one example from the Science paper published in 2013, comparing poor farmers in India. These are sugarcane farmers, so you just harvest once a year. That means that right after you harvest, you're rich, you're flush with cash, and right before, you're as poor as it gets. It's been basically a year since you were paid last time. And that happens almost by chance because of the way this sugar refineries work. And so if you just compare them, what they show here, this is, Raven's matrix is just a way of measuring your IQ. That's post-harvest, so let's say rich. The IQ measure that's corresponding to this test is equivalent to normal. Whereas if you're just before harvest, poor, that's equivalent, this difference is so large that it's equivalent to being cognitively impaired. So that's the size of the effect on your cognition of just having a lot less money. That shows up also in the response time. So you're much slower before harvest when you're poor, and you make a lot more mistakes. That's hard to see here. You make a lot more mistakes in pre-harvest when you're poor.
Good, that me?
Yes.
On the panel there with all the pictures, at the very top, there's a little button. Just click on that little button.
This one?
The one to the left. Yeah, that works.
Okay. Thank you. So there you see a little bit of the consequences of being poor for your cognitive performance. Of course, it's very conceptual in a way, and that started in 2013 with lab experiments. But more and more, you see this is a super recent active literature trying to show that this actually matters outside of the lab, for real decisions. I have work on Northeast Brazil showing that rainfall shocks affect farmers' attentions. There's work in the US for high schools actually showing that questions that are framed in financial, the same question, math question, if it's framed in financial terms or not. Let's say it's saying allocate, you have some money, you want to give 75% of it to your neighbor. How much is that? Whereas if I say you have like cookies and you want to give 75% of the cookies, it's the same question. When it's in financial terms, the higher the share of poor kids in the school, the worse is their performance, the more time they take with that. So lots of evidence now that these financial worries among the poor, they not only cost in terms of the cognitive resources, but it actually translates into worse outcomes in real tests. A more recent evidence from India showing that also affects workers' attention patterns, mistakes, and productivity out in the real world. Now the question is, presumably, and all of those could generate poverty traps, of course. If the kids from poor families, they perform worse, than the rich kids given the same question, but just depending on how it's framed. If the poor farmers make more mistakes, if the poor workers make more mistakes, that all could lead to these poverty traps. The question is, is that also the case when it comes to parents' investments in children? Presumably yes, but there's no evidence today to go try to fill in that gap. Why should we care about that? Why should we care about that? Well, first, when we try to increase investments in children, health or education, we typically tend to try to relieve liquidity constraints. So we try to either give cash to those families or to provide credit lines, anything that takes liquidity constraints out of the way. Or we often try to provide more accurate information. But the thing is, if inattention coming from poverty is important, then it could be the case that despite relieving liquidity constraints, despite relieving information gaps, it could still be the case that underinvestment and investment misallocation will arise, because this inattention will still be there. Financial worries are still there after all. The second thing is, if this mechanism ultimately is important, then there is a new set of policy instruments that we could use to try to increase investments in children by modifying the decision environment such that investment returns are top of mind and so on. I'll speak much more about that as we go. Why? We want to answer that question, but answering this question is very hard. Why is that? Because if I want to isolate the psychological effects of poverty as mechanisms, then it's hard because poverty comes as a bundle, right? So if I just compare poor and rich parents and how they make decisions, poverty will come also with liquidity constraints, differences in beliefs, for instance, because rich parents tend to have more prior experience with those investments, with education. And also just other consequences of poverty, right? The poor, they eat less, they sleep less, and they might differ also in preferences and so on. So to get around those challenges, we're going to undertake an experiment in Brazil where we give parents of public school children the opportunity to invest in an educational program. We're going to tinker with the environment to get around all these confounding factors. So first off, I'll show you how we do it. We're going to offer parents this opportunity, taking away liquidity constraints. So poor and rich families will have the same ability to undertake that investment. Second, we're going to randomly assign a bunch of things here in the context of the experiment. So first, some parents will have prior experience with the program and some not. And that's going to be true both across rich and poor parents. Second, we're going to randomly assign financial worries. I'll tell you how we do that. But that's how we're going to try to get the psychological mechanism in isolation from everything else. And then last, we're going to play around with how salient these investment returns are to try to really nail this attention mechanism. There are more challenges. Even if we do all of that, the question that always arises, if let's say we find in this experiment that the poor parents make different decisions than the rich ones. So what? What do we conclude? We still don't know what's optimal. Maybe they're making different decisions for good reason. So here in the context of our experiment, it's going to be very special because we actually, I'll try to convince you that we know what is optimal for this parents. Because we have a prior experiment, we're going to be able to tell exactly what's kind of optimal for each child using machine learning techniques. We're going to be able to predict returns. And also, given the very special nature of how we're going to relieve liquidity constraints, we also know what the outside option is. And because we know what else they could do with that money, then we can actually, I think, credibly claim that we know what each parent should be doing in the context of this. So very special conditions, but then we can make hopefully a lot of progress in isolating that method. So just to preview the findings, in case you have to leave early or in case you stop paying attention, since this is a paper about inattention.
There's food on the line here. We were trying to take care of that hunger constraint.
Excellent. So first, we're going to show the financial worries generate investment misallocation even without liquidity constraints, and even for parents that have prior experience with the program. So it's very striking and very depressing in a way. So even those parents that could make the investment and that kind of know how the program is, they're still going to mess up, especially when we make them worry about their finances. And I'm going to show, if I have time, evidence for the specific mechanism that's driving this effect. So we're going to show that we have cognitive tests, so we can show exactly these attention patterns as the science paper has shown, and we're also going to show you what happens when we make this investment returns more salient. I'll not preview too much here because I hope I have time to talk about that. So here's the background. The investment that we're going to offer parents the opportunity to invest is this educational program called Edu Plus. I'll tell you more, but this is powered by a startup that I'm one of the co-founders. Disclosure. The program is just 2 text messages a week sent to parents over the course of the school year. And these messages, they don't have curricular content, so they're not trying to teach parents what kids are learning in math class, for instance, but they're mainly trying to bring parents and kids closer together. So here is an example of messages. It's 2 messages per week. So for instance, these parents, they're going to be parents of high school freshmen, so they're 15 years old, approximately. So they would get a message 1 week saying, look, adolescence is a challenging time. Try to follow your child's school life closely. And then a few days later, talk to your child, explain how you chose a profession, ask about what he or she is considering for college. How did you feel? It's great that you can offer this safe space. Do it consistently. So that's the kind of message the program sends. Very, very simple. You might imagine this makes no difference maybe because it's so light touch. But it turns out we have a previous evaluation of this program with over 20,000 parents in São Paulo State. And this program really boosts educational outcomes. So it improves test scores by about 0.1 standard deviation. It's about 1 school quarter ahead in math classes, in math test scores. And it decreases grade repetition rate by about 1/3 among 9th graders. So pretty large average impacts. What we can do here is also predict student-specific impacts. But anyway, the program works. We're going to offer parents the opportunity to invest in it. How we do that? So the former paper is about an experiment that took place in 2016. What we do is, among those 20,000 parents, we're going to be able to track about 11% of them. So 2,223 parents in 2017. By that time, in the previous experiment, all the kids were in the 9th grade. Now they're all high school freshmen. And then I'll show you how we offer them the opportunity to invest. But because of the former experiment, we can use machine learning techniques to predict to the best of our capacity what is the exact return on investment for each student associated with that program. So we're going to estimate causal force based on student characteristics. So we use gender, age, race, socioeconomic status, parents, college education or not, and also baseline attendance and test scores. So all information we have, trying to understand whether each kid benefits from the program and by how much. So that's a distribution of predicted impacts in terms of grade promotion rates. So that shows, of course, very few kids actually experience negative impacts from the program. It's just advancing. So that's really a small number. A few kids experience very low returns. So that there's a significant mass here. That's imagine this: the typical grade repetition, the average grade repetition in the 9th grade for our sample in the previous experiment is 9%, which is kind of high. But you see, for most of those kids, it's like up to 1/3 of that, which is the average impact that we find in the other paper. But you see, there's still a bunch of kids that benefit quite a lot, up to 20% higher. That's what the model would predict that they benefit in terms of the probability of advancing to the next grade. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. What we'll claim is, for this kid, of course, it's not optimal to invest in the program because it's negative return. But for all the others, just having 1 extra year of schooling has such huge returns that given the outside option, you see how it is. We just kind of basically everybody should be invested in this program because the student-specific returns are so. I multiply this by the expected wage gain of having like a 1 percentage point higher probability of being in school is just so high that it's going to be just trigger here that everybody should be invested. So these are just kind of returns from investing, but we still need to understand what's the baseline probability of advancing to the next grade. And so we're going to estimate just a simple probability or a simple model based on the same variables to understand on average what's every kid's probability of advancing to the next grade. Conditional or not are undertaking the investment. So that's the machinery that we need. For everything else, I'm going to show you. Everything that comes after this is much easier. And then you can just compare. But it's very cool because once you know what happens to each kid, whether they take the investment or not, then we can simulate everything. What happens to how is inequality if no one took the investment? What happens to inequality if everybody took the investment? And what happens under the different experimental conditions? Here we're going to, in this version of the paper that I present today, everything is going to be in terms of comparing high and low socioeconomic status kids. The way we're going to do that is, so we also ask parents about their income for all those kids, but several parents don't want to answer, right? But everybody answers their education status. So we're going to compare basically parents with a college education, which are 12% of our sample, to all the others. And those are going to be the high SES parents, the others are going to be low SES. Cool. So let me start showing you some numbers. So that's at first what happens if nobody took up the investment. And I'm just comparing what happened. What would happen according to our model, our predicted model, for high SES parent kids versus low SES. So here you see that's predicted grade repetition for high SES kids. You see it's something like 3.5% of those kids would repeat the grade. Whereas for the low SES kids, it's much higher, it's over 5%. So there's a huge gap here. 50% higher basically for the low SES kids if nobody undertook the investment. So that's already a hint that there is persistence, right? So the kids of low-income parents, those that didn't make it to college, they have a much higher probability of grade repetition. So it's likely that they will kind of repeat the same history. Now, what's good news here is if actually everybody took up the investment according to our predicted model, these differences you see that were highly significant here, they are no longer statistically significant here. There's still a difference, but statistically, those probabilities are now the same. They're lower for everybody, but they're particularly lower with the investment for the low SES kids. So everybody benefits from the program, but the low SES kids benefit to a greater extent. And these differences will no longer be significant. Of course, that's an unreal scenario where everybody, not unreal, I mean, the government could mandate the investment and then everybody would have it. But in the case where they have to choose, I'll show you what happens. And that's what's the interest of it. Good. So that's how we offer the opportunity to invest. So we say everything is going to be done over the phone. So it's a phone survey. We have the phone numbers of everybody because the previous experiment was about sending SMS, right? So we already have the phone numbers. We call them the year later. And then we say, look, you have already earned 10 reais in airtime credit. Just if you answer this call through the end. Now, do you want to keep those 10 reais as airtime credit? Or do you want to exchange that money for 6 months of that program? That's all. And then you say, if you'd like to exchange airtime by text messages, press 1. If not, press 2. To listen again, press 9. As simple as that, that's the investment decision. Why, although simple, this is key to our identification of the mechanisms here. First, there's no liquidity constraints. So it's not like I'm asking parents to find the money to fund that investment. Everybody has the chance. We just gave them money. But it's an investment, right? They have to give up on something if they choose to invest in that program. The good thing, though, is that in Brazil, at least, airtime credit is non-fungible. So it's not like you can use, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, often, if I give you money on your phone, you can do a lot with that. You can withdraw that money, you can send it to others. In Brazil, you cannot. You cannot do anything. You can just use it for phone calls, text messages, internet. And that amount is really low. Like if I give you 10 in airtime credit, it seems like a lot because most phones are never topped up for prepaid and paid. But with 10 reais is really nothing. In 2017, you couldn't even purchase a mechanical pencil. So it's really very low money. So we know, like, no, again, if I just compare to the expected return from investing in it, even if it increases the probability of advancing the grade by 1%, you should still do it because 10 reais is just very, very little. So that's the trick here. There is a cost of undertaking investment, but the cost is just very low. Although it's attractive, I'll show you a lot of parents decide to stick to the 10 reais because it's the mental accounting. Again, it's attractive, but it's really not a lot of money. So I want to claim that we know what's optimal, and the optimal thing is that, except for these very few parents with the negative returns, everybody should be invested in the program. Good. So I'll show you now. That's the baseline take-up. So if I just compare the high SES and the low SES parents in the control group of all our experiments, that's what we see. So about 50% of the high SES parents decide to exchange the 10 reais for the program. So it's not anywhere close to 100%. 50% of them decide to keep the 10 reais near 10 credit, but still 50% exchange. But among the poor, it's lower. It's above 1/3. So that's a 35%. 35 or 36% investment gap. Dramatic again, because remember, if the poor benefit more from the investment, as I showed you. Maybe they don't know, so that's something we're going to see. But although they benefit more, they take it up to a lesser extent without liquidity constraints. They could undertake it more, or to the same extent, but they still take it less. But that's just the investment gap. Let me show you what happened to the outcome gap. So again, that's without take-up. We had this 50% outcome gap. Now, take-up partially decreases that gap, but the gap is still very much there, highly statistically significant, and it's still a 1/3 gap. So just if you allow people to take it up, again, without liquidity constraints, but still they don't take it up as much, and that's a combination, that outcome of the percentage that takes it up, and also the joint distribution of take-up and predicted returns. So they don't completely undo this inequality. It's not like the highest return people are the ones actually sorting into investment. It's still very much. Yeah.
So what are take-ups?
What is that?
The take-up category, what is that? Baseline take-up and no take-up.
Oh, sorry.
What
No
is that?
take-up is if what we predict will happen if nobody had the SMS program.
Oh, okay.
And this is what happens in the control group of words. All right. So the good news, apparent good news is, so now let me look very quickly at what happens in this group that was just by chance randomly assigned in the previous experiment to receive these two messages a week for 6 months in the year before the experiment. So by chance, they have prior experience with the program. So let's see what happens. So in terms of the take-up, that's on the right. Here, I just kept the baseline for you guys to compare. So first off, it increases willingness to invest among both groups. So if you just received the program before, then you know these messages potentially are valuable, so you pick them up to a greater extent. That's true among both high SES and low SES parents. But it's much more true among the low SES parents. So the investment gap here is no longer statistically significant. If you have prior experience, amazing. So maybe that's what was driving this investment gap here. The poor parents didn't kind of know, maybe couldn't anticipate what the benefits of the program are. Yes.
Like, one suggestion in just presenting this would be not just to show the arrows like you have, but also to show the blue to blue and the red to red. Because the red to red, it's going to be statistically significant, that difference. And so that way you can demonstrate that it's such an appreciable gain. Because with the p-value of the 0.2 there, even though it's clear you're trying to demonstrate that the gap's chosen, your 0.2 is starting to get in that kind of place where, So I think that demonstrating that gap and that jump would be just a good way to do that.
A great suggestion. We'll do. So yeah, no, for sure. Look, this like 1/3, and this now is over 50%. So it's a huge increase. But now in the previous version of the paper, we stopped there. But now that we have the predicted returns, then one thing I was shocked to see is despite that huge spike now in the take-up, the outcome gap is still very much here. So that's misallocation, because now the rich and the poor take it up to the same extent, but it's just not the right type of poor parents that are taking it up. So you still see that, it's basically the same. If anything, maybe it's a little bit higher. So the wrong type of parents, when they have prior experience with the program, they take it up. It's wrong type, what I mean is the low return parents. The high return ones are still not taking it up. So why is that? And that's really where the paper, I think, can contribute. So is it the case that at least part of that SES investment and outcome gaps, even without liquidity constraints, even with prior experience with the program, is it the case that at least part of it is driven by the psychological effects of the program? That's what we're going to look at next. So of course, the challenge is this psychology of poverty is not randomly assigned. So we're going to use a trick from cognitive psychology, which is called priming. I don't know the extent to which you guys are familiar with it. The trick here is we're going to try to make something top of mind. So the idea is we all worry about finances at some point, but the poor worry about it systematically all the time. And so what we want to do here is kind of simulate for the duration of the call, which is going to be 5 minutes. We want to simulate how the poor feel all the time, very artificially here by strategically asking them questions that will make them worry about money, or make some people worry more about money than others. That's basically what we're going to do. That's how we implement it, as I also do in other studies. So everybody's going to receive, is going to listen to a question at the very beginning of that call. So before they make those investment decisions, the call starts with basically this question. So some people are going to listen to, what would you do if your child's school started charging $20 for school uniforms and you had to pay them by the end of this month? These are public schools, so uniforms are not charged. So we're kind of making them think about some counterfactual reality, what they actually would have to pay for those. But it's very little money, right? $20. That's going to be half of the people that would take up the call, pick up the call. Now the other half are going to listen to the same question, but now it's going to be $400. So now it's substantial. And then we'll check if these people are actually more worried about money than this other group. I'll show you in a second that the answer is yes. And then whether they decide differently to take up the investment. So we want to see the share of people who take up, but also who takes it up, right? Because we want to see if these gaps are at least partly driven by these financial reports. So both are kind of just hypothetical questions. So in principle, you're free to not pay attention to them, not worry after them, and so on. And if you're worried that it's bad news and people are going to associate I think education is bad and so on, everybody's getting this bad news, but so this question is just the same, just the amount. So that's the trick of the
Yeah. So wouldn't you worry about having differential attrition for people who start the call? Because you can't imagine that the people getting the treatment would be just oh, this is
crazy.
I'm not going to keep on the call. And
yeah, we're going to look into that. So that's a good question. It's not. It turns out it's not going to affect response rates, but it's a valid concern. So we'll look. That's the design. So you already know some people had prior experience with the program, some not, by random assignment in the prior experiment. You also already know that some people were primed and some not. What I haven't showed you yet, but it's coming, is that some people will be informed about what the predicted returns of the program are, and some people not. So it's a multi-arm experiment with many cells. I'll tell you more about other cells later. That's how it works. I mean, it's not. It seems complicated, but everything happens in 6 minutes. So the prior experiment happens in the year prior, in 2016. August through December. And then everything we do is in June 2017. 2 days before the call, we're going to inform some of those parents about the returns of the program over SMS, and then we call them. And then the call takes place in 6 minutes. So we do the survey experiments, this priming question at the very beginning. Then we ask parents about the investment decision. Do they want to exchange the 10 reais or keep it? And then we do a bunch of cognitive tests. We ask them if they're worried about how worried they are about money, to show the manipulation whether it works, and then we do a bunch of cognitive tests to show the attention method. So, oops. So first, very quickly, but just to get to Anna's point, so this is exactly testing if people who are primed, they stick to the end of the call to a greater extent. People who had more experience, people who were informed, and none of this matters. So we're in a good place here. It's not going to affect the selection of our subjects, and also everything is balanced. So I'm not going to spend time here, but you can see in the paper, it's not, all the groups that we compare are statistically identical in terms of their characteristics, parents and students. I'm just going to skip this. So first, let me show you that the priming actually works. So we ask them, how worried are you about not having enough money to pay for all household bills at the end of this month? And then we say, no, not at all, somewhat worried, very worried, or desperate. All these parents are kind of poor. So we want to have enough variation to find it. And here, just to show you that first, our sample is indeed poor. So, almost over 56% of them say they're very worried or desperate in all groups. So people are, in general, very worried about life. But the priming makes a difference. So those who were primed, they are 8.3% percentage points more likely, so kind of 15%, more likely to report that they're very worried or desperate. So the priming makes everybody more worried, but that's particularly true for the low SES parents. So they're 45% more likely to say they're desperate, being primed, compared to primed high SES ones. So if you're primed, you get more worried in general, but particularly so if you're low SES. So the priming works exactly as we would expect, right? They try to emulate this sensation among the poor. So the rich also get a little worried, but it's really like catastrophic among the poor. Now, does it make a difference? Yeah.
How are you splitting low and high SES?
College, parents, college education. The problem, so income, we only have categorical, but there's a lot of missing. So we went with college education. Next thing I want to do by David's suggestion also is race. So we haven't explored, but we can do that as well. So far, so everything I'm showing today is just like parents went to college. There's 12% of them that did. Those are the highest ones.
Just to be clear, you mean completed college or do you mean went?
At least attended.
Only attended?
It's only 12% already.
Is it both parents or just one of them?
Just the primary caregiver. I'm saying parents, but in truth, it could be the grandmother.
Okay.
Good. So first off, I mean, here you can see two graphs basically what happens. So this is, let me move this. With prior experience, and this is with prior experience and priming, right? So remember, with prior experience, there was no longer a significant SES investment gap, just in terms of the percentage that takes it up. Now, when we prime subjects, then this gap at least partially reopens. So this becomes again statistically significant, and the size of the gap is 2/3 of the original gap in the control group. So just being worried, it's not just that you report that you're a lot more worried, you're also less likely again to take up the investment, to exchange the 10 reais for the SMS program. And among the rich, you see this is not true. Remember, so you can just compare here, it's over 50% again. But among the poor, it's not as low as you were without experience. But even with experience, even without liquidity constraints, you're already taking up a lot less. But again, it's not just that we take it less. Again, let's look at the combination of this with who takes it up. And the way I'm going to do this next is just looking at the CDF of the probability of great repetition. Let me explain this graph because I think that there's a lot to learn here. So this is the probability of great repetition. You see in the sample goes from 0 to, oh, these are only the low SES parents. Only the low SES parents, it goes from 0 to 30%. So there are some kids that have a 30% chance of repeating grade. Some have a 0 probability. This, the full line here, is just if no one took up the program. Okay. So you can see, for instance, that for 60% of the kids, the probability of great repetition is less than 5%, say. And then for 40% is higher. That's how you read those lines, right? That's without any take-up. The dashed line is if everybody took it up. So the first thing you see, no one, already 20% of the kids have no probability of repeating the grade if they took up the investment. So the investment really helps, and it helps a lot. These kids, a bunch of kids that would have, they just have a 0 probability of grade repetition, and that doesn't happen with no take-up. You see, it already starts to the right. And then it seems to help the whole distribution, right? So this whole thing is shifted up. So you see, for instance, that 80% of the kids have less than a 5% probability of repeating the grade if everybody took it up. Whereas this probability was just kind of 60% with no take-up. But the question is, the reality is in between. It's not no take-up and it's not full take-up. So what do the different conditions do to this conditional, to this cumulative distribution? So here you see, yeah, sorry. Sorry. No. So this is baseline in blue. So you see baseline helps a little bit, but not that much, right? So remember baseline, there was some take up, like 1/3 of the low SES parents were taking up the investment, but because it's not really the right type of parents, not the high return ones that are taking it up, it's still very much close to the no take up line. So it helps a little bit, but not very much. Now with experience, that's the green line. Then you have a huge shift to the left. Then it's much closer to the full take up line. Now with priming, even with experience, that's the red one, it shifts to the right back again. So you see what priming does is quite catastrophic. It brings it back to almost the baseline, even though these parents have priority. Cool. Sorry. Now let me try to show how much time I have a little time. I can try to show you a little bit.
You're doing fine.
Great. So that's about the mechanisms now. Let me try to convince you that what's happening here is poverty-driven attention misallocation. So to measure attention, we're going to do some cognitive tests that are well known in the literature. Basically, two tests. One is called STROOP, the other is called digit span. I'll explain what these tests are. The trick here is going to pay parents for performance. So those that do well in this test, they're going to get 2 extra reais in airtime credit. So we want to have these small but immediate incentives to try to understand if they're motivated to actually, give those that are primed, if they're more motivated to actually perform well in those tests. So first, let me explain STROOP. Does anyone know what STROOP is? Raise your hand. Okay, great. So we're gonna do it live. If you are online, you can also do it. So you have to tell me as quickly and as accurately as you can what is the color that you see, regardless of the shape. Is it clear?
Mm-hmm.
Can we start? Okay. So go.
Blue,
Yellow,
orange,
green,
purple.
It's pretty hard, right? That's the trick in STROOP. So it's an attention and self-control test. It's it has this element that at some point it's going to make it tempting to say something else. And then the answer, of course, is not to what you're tempted to say. So concretely, the way we do it, this is based on another paper that I have, that we do this with poor farmers, but the logic is in this audio version, because these tests are typically visual tests, but we're doing them on the phone, right? So we have to create audio versions. So that's how we do it. Answer as fast as you can. How many times do you hear the digits 4 in the following sequence? 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. Very tempting to press 4, but the answer is never 4. That's it. Digit span is easier to understand. I give you a sequence of digits. The more digits you remember accurately in the right sequence, the more points you score, right? So based on those scores, then you get paid or not. That's all. All right, so here is what we find. Here's low SES parents, high SES parents, and comparing them. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Did you transform the STROOP test into an audio test, or
Yeah.
there's literature on it?
No, so in these other paper, then we validate it. So we do the face-to-face, in-person, face-to-face version, and the audio version, and then they correlate pretty well.
And I just feel that there are different mechanisms,
The STROOP and the digit span, or the audio and the visual?
the audio and the visual.
Audio-
One you're actually working, like it's working memory, and the other one, as you were saying, is more on self-control.
Oh,
So
yeah,
they're
yeah.
different, like,
Definitely.
mechanisms.
So they're capturing executive functions, but I agree, they're not the same, but they both involve an attention component. Yeah. But I agree, and it's imprecise to say it's just attention. That's right. But I thought you were asking about the visual and the audio. Do you think the visual and the audio capture different?
That's the thing, you need a little bit more, because STROOP is kind of like, there's history, people use it a lot.
Mhm.
So I don't know how that changes
I see.
the kind of input. You'd actually have to test it to say,
Yeah.
oh, this does the same. You're actually checking the same thing.
Yeah, so this other paper does that. So we check that first the performance correlates surprisingly well, because it's very different, right? The visual and the audio one, and also the shocks do very similar things to both. So well, I can send you the paper if you'd like to see. In this one, we just piggyback on prior work and say let's do this. But what do we find? So I'll start with the high SES parents. This is the distribution of scores, right? It's a bit bumpy because it's not a lot of tests, but it looks normal as you would expect. Now, prime is that the dashed line and control is the full line. There's no statistical difference between the distributions among the high SES ones. So I prime them. They say they're a bit more worried, remember, but no difference in the attention patterns here, in the performance in this cognitive test. Among the poor, though, then there is a significant difference, actually quite precisely estimated. So the dash distribution, which is the prime, shifts to the right. So the poor are doing better in these incentivized cognitive tests, when they're primed. What's going on here? That's actually consistent with some other findings. Often when you prime the poor, they do worse in those tests, but there's also some situations where they do better, especially if the tests are incentivized. That's an opportunity for short-term gains, very, very small gains, right? But these are immediate gains, and so they get more motivated. It's often called focus or autonomy. So we also find that for that kind of income range, the same as in São Paulo state, where we're working for this study, that for those that are prime, higher, close to the high end of the performance distribution, they actually do better in this test. There are other studies in India where prime subjects, they actually also do better. So that's consistent. So that's evidence to this attention mechanism being triggered by financial worries. Think of it, being worried about money makes you more attuned to these small immediate incentives, but that comes at a cost, right? As we showed, investment misallocation, because this depends on paying attention to some notion of future investment returns. The second way we're going to show that this is driven by attention misallocation is by making these investment returns more salient. So that's another way. One is just showing that your attention is shifted to something else. The other is I'm trying to get this into your attention, actually. But remember, we're going to look at two things. One is if I make these returns more salient by sending this SMS 2 days prior to the call, does it then increase your the take-up and of investments, and does it increase misallocation? The second is for those for whom the investment returns are salient, you see the case that the primary is no longer going to work. So that's what we're going to do. That's how we do it. So remember, it's an SMS experiment. So we send this over text messages 2 days prior to the call. Half the subjects just going to get a message that says, look, last year, almost 20,000 families in the state received that program. Whereas in the treatment, we're going to look at it. We want to tell something about predicted returns of the program. But it's very hard. Imagine I told parents, oh, this program actually increases your child's probability of moving to the next grade by 1%. It's very hard to understand. So we said, let's inform them about the predicted effect of the program on school absences. It's easier to understand, right? And it's going to give us another advantage I'll tell you soon. So you see the program decreased absenteeism either by 0, some kids 0 effect on absenteeism. Other kids went short 3 classes. So kids would miss less math classes over the course of 6 months as an effect of the program. So we tell parents exactly what we predict over SMS 2 days before they take up the call with the investment decision. So we're going to compare those that got the control message to those that got the kid-specific prediction. So for those, regardless of what exactly the prediction is, investment returns were made more salient. So we just made them pay attention to it.
What was the prediction based on? What were the characteristics?
So same thing. So gender, age, race, socioeconomic status, same things we use to predict the actual returns. We just, instead of predicting grade repetition, we're predicting absenteeism. Now, this is a demanding control group because the control seems pretty, I mean, if you think of it and you get a message saying, look, so many people took this program last year, and then the call is going to ask you, do you want this program? You might imagine that the control might want you to have it more, right? I mean, social norms, so many people have it, maybe I should have it more as well. But now we're going to test if, actually receiving information that's specific to your kid made you want it more, actually. Yeah, then we also look at distribution. So the additional thing that buys us is that this was seriously just by chance, but it makes it very convenient. We wanted to communicate something easy. So we said, predicted impacts on attendance. But it turns out the impacts of the program on attendance were completely uncorrelated with the predicted effects of the program on grade repetition. So the kids that benefited by missing less classes were not necessarily the kids who benefited by having a higher probability of moving to the next grade. It's like the inframarginal kids benefited in terms of attendance. So you see the correlation between predicted returns for grade promotion and attendance are nearly 0, even negative. And even if I just restrict attention to like, you have a positive effect of the program, like non-zero on attendance and a positive effect on grade promotion, it's also like super small. So why is that important? Because then what I'm going to claim is that this informational treatment was actually just salience. So we're going to make future returns salient, but it's not really informative. Because I'm telling your kid, like, thanks to the program, misses three less classes. That's just completely uncorrelated with whether this is more or less beneficial in terms of grade potential. So it's really going to speak to the attention mechanism, not so much to the belief of thing. Great. So now I'll show you what the intervention does. So first off, this is okay. Take up, and here is going to be the expected grade repetition. So first, information, despite this demanding control, is going to increase take up significantly. Not by a lot, but you see it goes from 35% to something like 38%. So it increases by about 10% in take up of the program. Again, despite the control telling you that many parents had it last time, but much more than the percentage of parents who take it up. The right parents take it up now, because it's a huge effect on the predicted grade repetition. For those that got the kind of, for whom the returns on investment were made salient. So this decreases by a lot. Another way to see that is if I show you this cumulative distribution again. Then you see again, the full line is without any take-up. The dashed line is with full take-up. And then you see with just information, making returns salient, it already gives you, without prior experience, without anything, it already gives you a lot of the gains that full take-up would. So it's much closer to the full take-up. Just making future return more salient. And the last bit is, if I show you in a regression, where the effects of the priming are, they're fully concentrated in the group of parents for whom there was no information. So here you can see this is expected grade repetition. With prior experience, this goes down. So if you're more experienced, take up the investment, and it's the right type of parents who take up the investment, grade repetition falls. Among the poor, if you're prime, then part of this effect is undone, right? But among the informed parents, there's nothing going on, especially not with the low SES parents. So making return salient not only increase investment and decrease misallocation, also kind of shield the parents against these effects of financial worries on investment take-up and investment misallocation. Good. So that allows me to conclude what we've shown here. It's the first piece of evidence that these psychological effects of poverty can actually generate these poverty traps, right? Because in terms of investments in children's human capital. Because poor parents, they're more vulnerable to the effects of financial worries on the take-up of investment and being sensitive also to who benefits more from it. We've shown also the mechanism that this is driven by attention, poverty-induced attention misallocation. That can also explain, I mean, much more broadly, we often see the right type of parents, as I said, take up like, many investments, including like malaria test, malaria treatment. That could be driven even when these treatments are free. So that is again consistent with maybe attention misallocation, as we documented in this book. In terms of policy, first, this shows that maybe alleviating liquidity constraints is not enough. So if I provide an earmarked credit line, targeted subsidies, vouchers, all this takes away liquidity constraints. Maybe I also run an information campaign, and these parents are informed about what they should be doing. But still, what we show is that this is not enough. There's still an SES investment gap, an SES outcome gap, because poverty imposes the psychological tax. So what should you do? Well, there are two things that this mechanisms would suggest that you should do to try to eliminate those gaps. The first is if you try to make investment returns top of mind, we've shown that this delivers most of the benefits of full take-up. So if you understand that the poverty that has this effect, so you can try to modify this decision environment and get the investment returns to be salient. But the other thing is if you just make decisions automatic, as they are right in developed countries, you often don't have to decide whether you take up these investments. These decisions are made for you. Then we could actually eliminate inequality, as we've shown in the beginning of it. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to present.